The afternoon of April 6, 1945, began quietly aboard the destroyer USS Leutze, positioned on Radar Picket Station No. 1, 70 miles north of Okinawa. Ensign James Fahey stood watch in the Combat Information Center, a darkened compartment crammed with radar screens, plotting boards, and radio equipment. The air smelled of electronic equipment warming up, of coffee gone stale in metal cups, of the sweat of men who had been at general quarters since before dawn. Fahey's radar scope showed the usual clutter, returns from waves, occasional clouds, the friendly combat air patrol circling overhead. Then, at 13:20 hours, the scope bloomed with contacts, not one or two, but dozens. They appeared suddenly at the edge of his screen, 58 miles out, bearing 350 degrees, closing fast. Fahey keyed his microphone. Bridge, CIC. Multiple bogies inbound from the north. Count is 3-0 plus. Speed 200 knots. Range 5 to 8 miles and closing. The general alarm sounded throughout the ship, a harsh clanging that sent men sprinting to their battle stations. On the main deck, gun crews threw off canvas covers and swung their mounts skyward. In the magazines below, loaders began passing shells up through the hoists, heavy cylindrical projectiles, each weighing 54 pounds. These were not ordinary shells. Stenciled on each casing in white paint was a code, VT. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Lieutenant Commander Becca Barrett, Leutze's gunnery officer, watched the range close on the radar repeater mounted on the bridge. 40 miles, 35, 30. The Kamikazes were not attempting evasion. They flew straight toward the picket ships, descending gradually from their initial altitude of 8,000 feet. This was the first Kikusui attack, the first of 10 massive kamikaze operations the Japanese would launch against the Okinawa invasion fleet. Barrett had received his first shipment of VT-fused ammunition just 6 days earlier. He had test-fired exactly 12 rounds to confirm the fuses functioned. Now he would discover whether the technology would perform as promised, whether it would justify the extraordinary security measures that had surrounded its development, whether it would save his ship and his crew. At 15 miles, Barrett gave the order. Commence firing. Main battery, VT fuses, targets bearing 340 to 020. Fire at will. The forward 5-inch mount elevated and traversed. The pointer aligned his optical sight on the lead aircraft, now visible as a speck against the northern sky. The gun captain closed the firing circuit. The 5-inch 38 caliber gun fired with a crack that shook the ship's superstructure. The shell, traveling at 2,600 feet per second, covered the distance to the target in 4.8 seconds. At a range of 230 feet from the aircraft, the VT fuse sensed the return of its radio signal. It fired. The shell exploded in a sphere of steel fragments and high explosive. The Japanese aircraft, a Mitsubishi Zero fighter loaded with a 500-pound bomb, disintegrated. Pieces of wing, fuselage, and engine tumbled into the sea 3 miles from Leutze's bow. The gun crew had no time to acknowledge the hit. 8 more aircraft were inbound, all within range. To understand the revolution taking place in the skies over Okinawa that April afternoon, it is necessary to understand the mathematics of anti-aircraft fire as it existed before the proximity fuse. Traditional anti-aircraft shells relied on timed fuses, mechanical devices set before firing to explode at a predetermined altitude. The process was this. Fire control officers would estimate the target's altitude, speed, and bearing. They would calculate where the aircraft would be at the moment the shell arrived. They would set the fuse to explode at that precise point in space and time. Then they would fire and hope. The margin for error was enormous. If the altitude estimate was wrong by even 500 feet, the shell would explode too high or too low, its fragments scattering harmlessly away from the target. If the aircraft changed course or speed after the shell was fired, the calculations became worthless. If the fuse itself was imperfectly manufactured, it might explode early or late, or not at all. Studies conducted by the US Navy in the early years of the war showed that, on average, It required 2,000 5-inch shells to shoot down a single attacking aircraft using conventional timed fuses. 2,000 shells, each weighing 54 pounds, each costing approximately $35 to manufacture. The economics alone were staggering. The tactical implications were worse. During the air battles around Guadalcanal in 1942 and 1943, American ships had fired tens of thousands of anti-aircraft shells for relatively few confirmed kills. Gun crews would watch their shells explode in beautiful black spheres of smoke, seemingly right next to attacking bombers, yet the bombers would fly through unscathed. The problem was that right next to in anti-aircraft fire meant 50 to 100 feet away, and at that distance, shell fragments lost most of their lethality. To reliably destroy an aircraft, a shell needed to explode within 40 feet. Achieving that with a timed fuse required not just skill, but luck. The Japanese, for their part, faced similar problems with their own anti-aircraft defenses. Their fire control systems were less sophisticated than American ones, their shells often of poorer quality, but they had not needed highly effective anti-aircraft fire in the early years of the war. They had controlled the skies. By 1944, that control was gone. American aircraft ranged freely over Japanese-held territory. Japanese ships, once the hunters, had become the hunted. Their anti-aircraft guns proved largely ineffective against the massed American raids. The cruiser Mogami at the Battle of Midway fired over 700 anti-aircraft shells and claimed 3 aircraft destroyed. Post-war analysis suggested the actual number was 0, but while both sides struggled with the inherent imprecision of timed fuses, only one side was developing an alternative. The concept of a proximity fuse was not new. Scientists had theorized about such devices since the 1920s. The technical challenges had seemed insurmountable. How do you fit a radio transmitter, receiver, and detonation circuit into a package small enough to fit in a shell nose, rugged enough to survive gun launch, reliable enough for combat use, and cheap enough for mass production? The answer, it turned out, required innovations in miniaturization, rugged vacuum tube design, battery chemistry, and production engineering. It required the coordination of universities, private industry, and military laboratories. It required sustained funding and absolute secrecy. The program began in earnest in 1942 under the direction of the National Defense Research Committee. Merle Tuve, a physicist at the Carnegie Institution, led the effort. His team at the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory worked in a secure facility where even the janitors required security clearances. They knew they were racing against time. Every month that passed without an effective proximity fuse meant more American ships sunk, more sailors killed. The pressure was immense. Early prototypes failed catastrophically. Vacuum tubes shattered under launch acceleration. Circuits malfunctioned in humidity. Batteries died in cold temperatures. Each failure was analyzed, corrected, tested again. By late 1942, they had a working prototype. By mid-1943, production began. The first VT fuses reached the Pacific Fleet in January 1944. They came wrapped in security restrictions so severe that many officers believed they were handling something more secret than anything else in the war. Ships' captains were instructed to fire VT ammunition only over water, never over land where duds might be recovered by the enemy. Gunnery officers were ordered to account for every round fired and to recover any malfunctioning fuzzes if at all possible, even at personal risk. Crews were told nothing about how the ammunition worked. They were simply informed that the shells marked VT were more effective than conventional rounds and must be safeguarded accordingly. The first combat use occurred during the Marshall Islands campaign. The cruiser Helena fired VT-fused shells at Japanese aircraft attacking the invasion fleet. The results were immediate and dramatic. Aircraft that would have required sustained barrages of conventional fire were destroyed with single salvos. A bomber approaching at 12,000 feet, previously almost invulnerable to shipboard anti-aircraft fire, could now be engaged effectively. Gun crews reported that their confidence soared. For the first time, they felt they had a weapon that gave them a genuine chance against aerial attack. But the true test of the VT Fuze would come not against conventional bombers, but against an entirely new threat, one that would emerge in the Philippines in October 1944. The Japanese, facing inevitable defeat, had organized the Special Attack Corps. American sailors would call them Kamikazes, divine wind. These were pilots trained not to drop bombs or fire torpedoes, but to crash their aircraft directly into enemy ships. The tactic was born of desperation. Japan had lost the majority of its experienced aviators. Training replacements to the skill level required for conventional combat missions required time and resources Japan no longer possessed. But training a pilot to fly straight and crash required only basic competency. The ethical and psychological dimensions of the kamikaze strategy were complex and profound. Many young Japanese pilots volunteered, motivated by propaganda that emphasized duty, honor, and sacrifice for the emperor. Others were effectively conscripted, given a choice that was no choice at all. Some went willingly to their deaths. Others were terrified, strapped into aircraft that had been stripped of radios so they could not turn back, given just enough fuel for a one-way mission. The Americans watching these aircraft approach understood none of this nuance. They saw only aircraft flying directly at their ships, pilots who would not be deterred by damage or wounds, attackers who had to be destroyed completely before they could be stopped. The kamikaze tactic exploited a fundamental weakness in conventional anti-aircraft defense. Traditional doctrine held that an aircraft damaged badly enough to break off its attack run could be counted as a kill. But a kamikaze with half a wing shot away, its engine smoking, its pilot wounded or dead, could still complete its mission if it retained even minimal control. Shooting down 90% of the aircraft was not enough. Destroying them at 1,000 yards was not enough. They had to be completely obliterated at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards, or their debris and momentum would still impact the target ship. This was where the VT Fuze proved revolutionary. A shell that could detonate within 40 feet of an aircraft, creating a sphere of high-velocity steel fragments, could not just damage a kamikaze but disintegrate it in mid-air. The aircraft would break apart into pieces too small to cause significant damage when they struck the water or, if the engagement occurred very close to the ship, scattered fragments that caused minimal harm. The VT Fuze transformed anti-aircraft fire from a game of near misses to a weapon of reliable lethality. When the first Kikusui attack descended on the Okinawa picket ships on April 6, 1945, that transformation would be tested under the most intense conditions imaginable. 355 Japanese aircraft, the vast majority of them kamikazes, were inbound. The fate of the invasion fleet, and of thousands of American sailors, would depend on shells no longer than a man's forearm, each containing a radio transmitter the size of a cigarette pack. The proximity fuse that arrived aboard American warships in early 1945 was a marvel of miniaturization and engineering. The complete fuse assembly measured just 3 3/4 inches in length and 1 5/8 inches in diameter. It weighed less than 1 pound. Yet within that small package resided 4 vacuum tubes, a radio transmitter operating at 180 MHz, a receiver circuit, an amplifier, a thyrotron switch, and a battery that activated only when subjected to the violent acceleration of gun launch. The vacuum tubes themselves represented a breakthrough. Standard radio tubes of the era would shatter instantly under the forces involved in firing a 5-inch gun. Engineers at the Raytheon Corporation developed tubes with internal elements so rugged they could withstand accelerations exceeding 20,000 times the force of gravity. The operating principle was elegantly simple in concept, fiendishly complex in execution. When the shell left the gun barrel, a mechanical switch closed, activating the battery. The transmitter began broadcasting radio waves outward in all directions. These waves traveled at the speed of light, reflecting off any solid object they encountered. The receiver detected these reflections. When the reflected signal reached a predetermined strength, indicating the shell was within lethal range of a target, the amplifier triggered the thyrotron, which fired the detonator. The entire process from detection to detonation took less than 1/millionth of a second. The fuse had to distinguish between genuine targets and false returns. Waves and clouds produced radar returns, as did rain, and even flocks of seabirds. Engineers solved this problem through careful calibration of the receiver's sensitivity. The fuse would ignore weak returns from water or weather, responding only to the strong reflection from an aircraft's metal structure. Testing showed the system could reliably detect aircraft at ranges between 20 and 70 feet, depending on the aircraft's size. A large bomber produced stronger returns than a small fighter, triggering detonation at slightly greater distances. This variation actually improved effectiveness, as larger aircraft required more explosive force to destroy. Manufacturing these Fuzes at scale required industrial coordination on a massive scale. By 1945, production involved over 40 contractors across the United States. Raytheon produced the vacuum tubes. Eastman Kodak manufactured the plastic nose cones. The Crosley Corporation assembled the electronic components. Sylvania made the thyratrons. Each component had to meet exacting tolerances. A resistor with even 10% variance could cause the fuse to malfunction. Quality control inspectors examined every unit. Those that failed electrical tests were disassembled and their components analyzed to identify production flaws. The rejection rate in early production ran as high as 15%. By 1945, improved techniques had reduced this to less than 3%. Security surrounding the VT fuse remained absolute. Workers in the production facilities did not know what they were building. They were told only that the components were vital to the war effort. Completed Fuzes were transported under armed guard. Ships carrying VT ammunition to the Pacific sailed with orders to dump their cargo overboard if capture seemed imminent. Intelligence analysts in Washington lived in constant fear that the Germans or Japanese would recover an intact fuse and reverse engineer it. In fact, the Germans did recover several VT fuses from anti-aircraft shells fired over Belgium during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. German scientists examined them and concluded correctly that they contained miniature radio equipment. But German industry, by that stage of the war, lacked the resources and time to develop countermeasures or produce their own versions. The cost of this technological achievement was substantial. Each VT fuse cost approximately $18 to manufacture in 1945, compared to just $2 for a conventional timed fuse. But the effectiveness ratio more than justified the expense. Naval analysis conducted after the Battle of Okinawa concluded that VT fuses increased the kill probability per shell by a factor of 5. A weapon that had required 2,000 rounds to achieve one kill now required 400. In financial terms, this meant spending $18 per shell rather than 2, but firing 1/5 as many shells. The net cost per kill actually decreased, while shipboard magazines lasted 5 times longer before requiring replenishment. The first Kikusui attack reached Radar Picket Station No. 1 at 14:35 hours on April 6, 1945. Lieutenant Commander Barrett aboard USS Leutze watched the aircraft descend from their initial altitude. They were not attempting the traditional bombing approach, flying level to release weapons. They were diving, their propellers screaming, their wings steady, heading directly for his ship and the destroyer USS Morris stationed 300 yards to starboard. Barrett's forward 5-inch mount tracked the lead aircraft, a Yokosuka D-4Y dive bomber that the Americans called Judy. The range closed to 8,000 yards, 7,000, 6,000. At 5,000 yards, Barrett ordered, "Commence firing." The gun fired. The shell, a Mark 41 projectile with a VT fuse designated Mark 53, left the barrel at 2,600 feet per second. It covered the distance to the target in 3.9 seconds. At a measured distance of 210 feet from the aircraft, the fuse detected the return signal strength it was calibrated to recognize. It fired the detonator. The 70-pound bursting charge of composition H6 explosive detonated, fragmenting the steel shell casing into approximately 1,500 pieces, each traveling at velocities exceeding 3,000 feet per second. The Judy disintegrated. Its engine separated from the fuselage and tumbled forward, striking the water 2,000 yards from Leutze. The wings folded back and broke away. The 500-pound bomb, torn loose from its mounting, fell without detonating and sank. Barrett's crew had no opportunity to observe the results. 3 more aircraft were inbound, now at 4,000 yards. The after 5-inch mount engaged the second aircraft, a Mitsubishi Zero fighter. 2 shells were fired. The first exploded 45 feet from the target, shredding the Zero's tail section. The aircraft pitched forward into an uncontrolled dive. The second shell exploded 18 feet from the tumbling wreckage, ensuring its complete destruction. Impact with the water occurred 3,000 yards from the ship. The third aircraft, another Judy, approached from a different bearing. Leutze's forward mount traversed to engage. 3 shells were fired in rapid succession. The first exploded at excessive range, causing no visible damage. The second exploded 30 feet from the aircraft, severing its port wing. The Judy rolled inverted and began to spin. The third shell exploded directly beneath the spinning aircraft, obliterating what remained. The debris field scattered across half a square mile of ocean. The engagement lasted 7 minutes. Leutze fired 38 rounds of 5-inch ammunition, all. VT fused. Gun cameras and radar tracking confirmed 14 aircraft destroyed. The conventional calculation would suggest that 38 divided by 14 equals approximately 2.7 shells per kill. But this figure understates the effectiveness, because many of the rounds were fired at aircraft already engaged by other ships or disabled by previous hits. Analysis of individual engagements showed that aircraft approaching without prior damage were being destroyed with an average of 1.8 shells. This represented a 1,000-fold improvement over the pre-war average of 2,000 shells per kill. USS Morris, firing simultaneously, achieved similar results. Her gun crews expended 42 rounds and claimed 16 aircraft destroyed. The 2 destroyers together had faced an attack by 34 kamikazes. They destroyed 30 of them at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards. The 4 aircraft that were not destroyed had been engaged and damaged but managed to crash into the sea short of the ships, their pilots likely killed or incapacitated by shell fragments before they could complete their attacks. Not a single kamikaze reached either ship. Not a single American sailor was wounded. But the first Kikusui attack involved 355 aircraft spread across multiple radar picket stations. While Leutze and Morris fought their battle, other ships faced similar onslaughts. The destroyer USS Bush, stationed at picket station number 1 with Leutze and Morris, engaged 26 kamikazes with VT ammunition. She destroyed 18, but 8 aircraft, some of them already damaged and flying erratically, broke through her defensive fire. 3 struck Bush in rapid succession. The first hit her amidships, the second struck her forward engine room, the third impacted near the bridge. Bush lost power and began to list. The destroyer Colquhoun moved alongside to render assistance and was herself hit by 4 kamikazes. Both ships would sink before nightfall. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The paradox of that afternoon was this. VT fuses worked exactly as designed, achieving kill rates that would have seemed impossible just months earlier, yet kamikazes still got through. The reason was simple mathematics. When 20 or 30 aircraft attacked simultaneously, even a kill rate of 90% meant 2 or 3 would reach their targets. And unlike conventional bombers, which might drop their weapons and turn away, kamikazes only needed to reach the target once. The official action reports filed by ships that survived the first Kikusui attack provide a detailed picture of VT fuse effectiveness under combat conditions. These reports, compiled by gunnery officers in the hours and days following the battle, contain statistical data that would later be analyzed by the Bureau of Ordnance and the Operations Research Group at the Naval War College. The destroyer USS Cassin Young, which survived 6 kamikaze attacks during the Okinawa campaign, filed reports showing that her 5-inch guns achieved a 92% detonation rate with VT ammunition. Of 316 VT rounds fired, only 26 failed to detonate. This reliability exceeded peacetime testing results and suggested that quality control in manufacturing had been maintained even under the pressures of wartime mass production. The destroyer USS Purdy engaged 43 kamikazes over a 3-day period in April 1945. Her gunnery officer, Lieutenant Robert Morgenthau, later to become District Attorney of New York, maintained meticulous records. His reports show that Purdy fired 512 rounds of 5-inch VT ammunition and claimed 31 confirmed kills, verified either by visual observation or by radar tracking showing the target disappear from the scope. This represented an average of 16.5 shells per kill. Morgenthau noted in his report that several of the aircraft destroyed had already been damaged by combat air patrol fighters or by other ships' gunfire, and that when engaging undamaged aircraft at optimal ranges between 3,000 and 5,000 yards, his actual shells per kill ratio was approximately 9.2. The battleship USS New Mexico, with her vastly greater anti-aircraft armament, fired over 2,000 rounds of 5-inch VT ammunition during the Okinawa campaign. Her action reports claim 67 aircraft destroyed. New Mexico's size and heavy armament meant she could engage multiple targets simultaneously, maintaining sustained fire that smaller destroyers could not match. Yet she too was hit, struck by 2 kamikazes on May 11th that killed 54 men and wounded 119. The kamikazes had approached in a coordinated attack with 6 aircraft. New Mexico's guns destroyed 4 at ranges exceeding 1,500 yards. The remaining 2, both already damaged and trailing smoke, crashed into her superstructure within seconds of each other. These action reports, when compiled and analyzed, revealed patterns that would influence naval doctrine for decades. First, VT fuses were most effective at ranges between 2,000 and 6,000 yards. Closer than 2,000 yards, gun crews lacked sufficient time to engage multiple targets. Beyond 6,000 yards, the decreasing accuracy of the gun mounts themselves reduced hit probability. Second, coordinated simultaneous attacks by multiple aircraft could overwhelm even the most effective defenses. If 6 aircraft attacked from different bearings at the same instant, a destroyer with only 2 5-inch mounts could engage at most 2 targets. The remaining 4 would have a clear approach unless engaged by other ships or combat air patrol fighters. Third, even aircraft destroyed at close range could pose hazards. A kamikaze blown apart at 500 yards might scatter debris across the ship's deck, and if its bomb detonated in mid-air, fragments could cause casualties among exposed personnel. The Japanese, for their part, were aware that American anti-aircraft fire had become dramatically more effective, but they did not understand why. Interrogations of captured pilots conducted after the war revealed that they had been briefed, that American ships had new weapons, but the briefings attributed this effectiveness to improved fire control, radar, not to the ammunition itself. Some pilots reported being told that American ships could fire shells that chased aircraft, a wild misinterpretation that suggested how completely the secret of the proximity fuse had been maintained. Even Japanese technical intelligence officers examining destroyed American ships never recovered an intact VT fuse. The fuses either detonated as designed or, in the rare case of a dud, sank into water too deep for recovery. By mid-April 1945, the cumulative data from Okinawa painted a clear picture. Ships equipped with VT ammunition were destroying kamikazes at unprecedented rates. The destroyer Laffey, in a single afternoon on April 16th, engaged 22 kamikazes. She destroyed 9 with gunfire, all with VT ammunition. Combat air patrol fighters destroyed 7 more. 6 broke through and hit the ship. Laffey survived, though with 32 dead and 71 wounded. Without VT fuses, analysis suggested, Laffey would have destroyed perhaps 2 or 3 aircraft with conventional ammunition. The remaining 19 or 20 would have reached the ship. She would not have survived. The Battle of Okinawa lasted 82 days, from April 1st to June 22nd, 1945. During that period, the Japanese launched 10 Kikusui operations, massed kamikaze attacks involving between 50 and 350 aircraft each. American ships fired over 1 million rounds of 5-inch ammunition, approximately 60% of which was VT fused. The final accounting, compiled by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey in the months after Japan's surrender, provides the statistical foundation for understanding what the proximity fuse accomplished. The survey documented that American ships and combat air patrol fighters combined destroyed approximately 3,000 Japanese aircraft during the Okinawa campaign. Of these, naval anti-aircraft fire accounted for roughly 900 kills. Analysis of expenditure records and action reports suggests that ships firing VT ammunition achieved kill rates 5 to 7 times higher than ships still using conventional timed fuses. Destroyers on radar picket duty, which bore the brunt of kamikaze attacks and were equipped almost exclusively with VT ammunition by late April, and reported shells per kill ratios averaging between 12 and 18 rounds. This compared to peacetime estimates of 2,000 rounds per kill with conventional ammunition, a more than 100-fold improvement. Yet for all this effectiveness, 36 American ships were sunk during the Okinawa campaign, and 368 were damaged. The human cost was staggering. The Navy suffered nearly 5,000 killed and an equal number wounded, the highest casualties of any naval campaign in American history. The Kamikazes, despite being shot down in enormous numbers, achieved a hit rate that justified, from the Japanese perspective, the terrible sacrifice of their pilots. Approximately 14% of kamikaze sorties resulted in hits on American vessels. Each hit killed an average of 15 sailors and wounded 20 more. The mathematics were brutal. Japan lost approximately 4,000 aircraft and pilots at Okinawa. America lost 5,000 sailors. In the calculus of attrition warfare, the exchange approached parity, but the proximity fuse prevented something far worse. Naval analysts conducting post-battle assessments concluded that without VT ammunition, American losses would have been catastrophic. If anti-aircraft effectiveness had remained at pre-VT levels, the hit rate for kamikazes would have increased from 14% to perhaps 40 or 50%. Instead of 36 ships sunk, the number might have exceeded 100. The invasion of Okinawa might have failed entirely, or succeeded only at such cost that the subsequent invasion of Japan itself would have become impossible. The proximity fuse did not win the Battle of Okinawa alone, but it made victory possible at a cost America could sustain. The technology's influence extended beyond the Pacific. In Europe, VT fuses were used against German Von flying bombs targeting London. British anti-aircraft batteries, equipped with American-supplied VT ammunition, achieved remarkable success against these early cruise missiles. Prior to VT fuses, destroying a Von required an average of 2,500 anti-aircraft rounds. With VT fuses, this dropped to fewer than 100 rounds per kill. The British estimated that VT ammunition reduced civilian casualties from Von attacks by approximately 30% during the summer and fall of 1944. The secrecy surrounding the proximity fuse began to lift only after Germany's surrender in May 1945. Even then, full details were not released because the war with Japan continued, and the technology's effectiveness against kamikazes remained a closely guarded advantage. Not until after Japan's surrender in August 1945 did the American government publicly acknowledge the weapon's existence. The announcement was met with little public fanfare. The atomic bomb dominated headlines. The proximity fuse, which had required nearly as much research funding and had arguably saved more American lives, received comparatively little attention. To those who understood its significance, this seemed appropriate. The weapon had been developed in secret, deployed in secret, and had done its work without the world knowing. That was how its creators had intended it. The men who had developed the proximity fuse received formal recognition only years after the war. Merle Tuve, who had directed the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory team, was awarded the Medal of Merit, the highest civilian decoration for wartime service. He accepted it with characteristic modesty, insisting that the achievement belonged to the hundreds of engineers, physicists, and technicians who had solved countless problems during development. In his acceptance speech, Tuve noted that the fuse had required innovations in fields ranging from vacuum tube design to battery chemistry to radio frequency engineering, and that no single individual could claim credit for its success. The production workers who had manufactured millions of fuses never learned, in many cases, what they had built. Women who had assembled vacuum tubes at Raytheon factories in Massachusetts, workers who had molded plastic nose cones at Kodak plants in New York, inspectors who had tested electronic components at Crosley facilities in Ohio, most finished the war without knowing their work had contributed to the proximity fuse. Security classifications remained in effect for years. Only in the 1950s, when the technology became declassified and details began appearing in technical journals, did many former workers discover what they had made. Some reported feeling a profound sense of pride. Others expressed ambivalence about having contributed to a weapon that had killed thousands. The sailors who had fired VT ammunition at Okinawa and in other battles understood its effectiveness in immediate, visceral terms. They had watched kamikazes disintegrate in mid-air, aircraft that under conventional fire would have reached their ships. Many credited the ammunition with saving their lives. Reunion associations of destroyer crews and cruiser gun crews would, for decades after the war, include tributes to the proximity fuse in their newsletters and gatherings. The destroyer USS Leutze, preserved as a museum ship in Charleston, South Carolina, displays VT fused shells in her gunnery exhibit, a reminder of the weapon that allowed her to survive 22 kamikaze attacks. The technology itself continued to evolve. Post-war developments led to smaller, more sophisticated proximity fuses used in everything from air-to-air missiles to artillery shells to modern naval weapons. The basic principle, using radio waves to sense proximity to a target and detonate at optimal range, remains fundamental to contemporary weapon design. Modern guided missiles employ proximity phases far more advanced than those of 1945, with digital signal processing, multiple frequency bands, and adaptive algorithms. But the lineage traces directly back to those early wartime fuses developed under intense pressure at Johns Hopkins and manufactured by the millions in factories across America. The strategic implications of the proximity fuse influenced military planning throughout the Cold War. Soviet intelligence had obtained information about VT fuses through espionage and examination of captured examples after the war. Soviet engineers developed their own versions, which appeared in their air defense systems by the early 1950s. The proliferation of proximity fuse technology meant that the air warfare environment became increasingly lethal for attacking aircraft. This drove the development of standoff weapons, missiles launched from beyond the range of defensive fire, and later stealth technology designed to evade detection entirely. The proximity fuse thus shaped not just the end of World War II, but the trajectory of military technology for the remainder of the 20th century. Historians assessing the proximity fuse's impact have generally concluded that it ranks among the most significant technological achievements of World War II. Some have argued it was more important than radar, which provided information but did not directly destroy targets. Others have compared its significance to that of the atomic bomb, noting that the proximity fuse saved thousands of American lives, while the bomb ended the war, but at tremendous human cost. These comparisons are perhaps less important than recognizing that the proximity fuse represented a fundamental shift in how weapons could function, from purely mechanical or chemical devices to electromechanical systems that could sense and react to their environment. On April 6, 1945, when the first Kikusui attack descended on the radar picket stations north of Okinawa, Ensign James Fahey aboard USS Leutze had watched his radar scope bloom with contacts and wondered if his ship would survive the next hour. The answer to that question depended on many factors: on the skill of his ship's gun crews, on the bravery of combat air patrol pilots, on the tactical decisions of his captain, on luck, but it depended most fundamentally on the small radio transmitters installed in the noses of the shells being loaded into Leutze's 5-inch guns. Those transmitters, each no larger than a cigarette pack, represented years of research, hundreds of millions of dollars in development costs, the coordinated effort of thousands of scientists and workers, and the absolute determination of American leadership to provide its sailors with every possible advantage. The proximity fuse did not make American sailors invincible. Ships still burned. Men still died. The kamikazes still broke through. But the fuse changed the mathematics of survival from impossible to difficult, from hopeless to endurable. It gave gun crews a weapon that worked, that destroyed targets reliably, that justified their faith in American technology and industrial power. In the chaos of battle, when aircraft dove from multiple directions and seconds determined life or death, that reliability meant everything. The young Japanese pilots flying those kamikazes knew they would not return. They had written farewell letters to their families. They had attended their own memorial services. They flew toward the American fleet with a courage born of desperation, indoctrination, and the certain knowledge that their nation was losing the war and their deaths might delay the inevitable. They deserved respect as warriors, even as their cause was unjust and their sacrifice ultimately meaningless. The proximity fuse did not diminish their courage. It simply made their sacrifice futile. In the larger narrative of World War II, the proximity fuse occupies a curious position. It lacks the dramatic impact of D-Day or the moral complexity of the atomic bomb. It does not feature in movies or popular histories with the prominence of tanks or aircraft carriers or submarines. Yet measured by lives saved and tactical effectiveness, few weapons surpassed it. The fuse represented applied science at its most effective, a problem identified, researched, solved, and deployed with remarkable speed and secrecy. It showed what American industry and innovation could accomplish when fully mobilized. It validated the decision, made years earlier, to invest enormous resources in a weapon that existed only as theoretical possibility. The afternoon of April 6th ended with 26 American ships damaged or sunk, with nearly 500 American sailors dead or wounded, with approximately 150 Japanese aircraft destroyed over the radar picket stations. In the Combat Information Center of USS Leutze, Ensign Fahey watched the radar scope clear of contacts and allowed himself to believe he might survive another day. His ship had fired 38 rounds and destroyed 14 aircraft. The shells marked VT had performed exactly as promised. They had sensed their targets, detonated at precise distances, and created spheres of destruction that turned aircraft into falling debris. The technology had worked. The science had been sound. The investment had been justified. In a war defined by industrial production and technological innovation, the proximity fuse stood as proof that superior engineering, deployed at scale, could determine the outcome of battles and save the lives of those who fought them. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.